Welcome to today's program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. With Christmas Day fast approaching, this program deals with Christmas during the Civil War. To give you some perspective, let me share with you some statistics on the number of young men in our Finger Lakes counties that served as soldiers for at least some part of the Civil War. My home county, Seneca County, at least 1,328 men served, with at least 276 dying while in that service. For neighboring Yates County, 2,109 men served. For Wayne County, 4,917. Many of the things that are part of our Christmas celebration today became widespread during the Civil War years. These include, first, Christmas trees decorated with strings of dried fruit and popcorn. 2, the image of Santa Claus as we know him today, with his red suit with a big black belt, his white beard, and so on. And many of the Christmas carols that we love were common during the Civil War years. Unfortunately, it's ironic that these wonderful Christmas festivities became commonplace at the same time that many, if not most, American families, both North and South, were saddened with the loss of soldiers in their families as a result of the horrors of the Civil War. Today, we almost take for granted that the President of the United States has 24/7 responsibilities. But this was largely true for President Lincoln during the Civil War. He had to spend at least part of his Christmas Day on some developments in the Civil War. For example, in 1861, he was trying to keep the Trent Affair from leading to an alliance between Great Britain and the Confederacy. Had such an alliance occurred, it would have severely dampened prospects of a Union victory in the Civil War. As president, Lincoln frequently visited Union soldiers in various hospitals in the D.C. area, and he did these visitations even on Christmas Day. With the major defeat of Confederate forces at Gettysburg in July of 1863, by Christmas of 1863, the prospects of a Union victory in a Civil War seemed likely. This meant that the Christmas 1863 season could be more joyous. Lincoln must have taken great comfort and joy in his son Tad's efforts to give gifts to many Union soldiers that Christmas. Christmas 1864 must have been even more joyous for President Lincoln, who had received news shortly before Christmas from General Sherman that his march to the sea had resulted successfully in the capture of Savannah, Georgia. With the Confederacy literally split, a Union victory in the Civil War seemed just a matter of time now. But the Civil War took its toll on President Lincoln. In these pictures, you can see clearly how he aged. From February of 1860, before the election, on through the early years of the Civil War, until a photograph just a few days before he was tragically assassinated. The war took its toll. Now, we think of Christmas Day as a time for celebration, but fighting did not completely stop even on Christmas Day in the Civil War. You can see here that for each year of the war, something was taking place. A blockade runner, for example, in 1861, is caught by a Union Navy, and the same day, 2 skirmishes took place, one in Virginia and one in Maryland. In 1864, Confederate forces repelled a Union assault of 60 warships on Fort Fisher, and in the western theater of the war, there were several skirmishes. During the Civil War, Thomas Nast became a full-time famous illustrator for Harper's Weekly. His work actually began early in 1862. It is this Thomas Nast who gave us many significant images that we use yet today. These include Santa Claus as we know him, the elephant as a symbol of the Republican Party, the donkey as a symbol of the Democrat Party, and Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall. Thomas Nast did many illustrations of various Civil War events as propaganda promoting the Union cause. This illustration by Thomas Nast portrays a wife separated from her soldier husband on Christmas Eve, 1862. On the inset circular image to the left, the wife is shown at the window, on her knees in constant prayer, looking up at the night sky, obviously distressed that her husband is not there. On the wall, pictures of the woman's husband can be seen. On the circular inset image on the right, the woman's husband can be seen sitting with his rifle around a lonely campfire. In his hand is a small album with photographs of his wife and children. He is obviously lonesome, missing his wife and children on that cold winter night. Surrounding these two circular images are a variety of scenes. In the upper left corner, an image of Santa Claus can be seen, with Santa crawling down into a chimney. In the lower left corner is an image of soldiers marching in the snow. The upper right corner has another image of Santa, this time in a sleigh being pulled by reindeer. This is one of Thomas Nast's earliest images of Santa. The lower right corner shows a ship being tossed in the sea. In the lower center, there is an image of the graves of soldiers lost in the war. By late 1862, the Union cause in the Civil War was still rather bleak. Not surprisingly, President Lincoln asked Nast to draw a cartoon showing Santa Claus visiting a camp of Union soldiers in the hopes of raising soldier morale, and it appeared on the cover of Harper's Weekly magazine. Looking at it more closely, as mentioned in the previous slide, President Lincoln asked Thomas Nast to draw an illustration of Santa visiting the troops. You will note in the background there is an entry arch with a sign that reads, "Welcome Santa Claus." Santa is shown handing out gifts to the soldiers and children. One soldier receives a new pair of socks, which no doubt was a wonderful gift for that soldier who was probably otherwise relegated to wearing his shoes without socks. Santa is pictured sitting on a sleigh, which is being pulled by reindeer. Santa has a long beard, a furry hat, collar, and coat. Perhaps the most interesting thing in this illustration is the special gift that Santa Claus is holding in his right hand. Santa is holding a dancing puppet of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States. Davis appears to have a string tied around his neck, so Santa appears to be lynching Jefferson Davis. Now, this is Thomas Nast's first published picture, of the rendition of Santa Claus that he will continue to modify. In our next Christmas scene, 1863, Thomas Nast has a number of captivating inset images. On the left is an image of little children asleep in bed, with Santa Claus coming from the fireplace with a bag of gifts on his shoulder. The center image shows a Civil War soldier, on furlough undoubtedly, coming home for Christmas. You will note that the family is ecstatic and celebrating his return with hugs and kisses. To the right, the children can be seen opening their gifts. Note the stockings hanging on the fireplace. At the bottom of this big image illustration are three small inserts. The one at the left shows the traditional manger scene for the birth of Christ and simply is labeled Eve. The center one is labeled furlough, something very important for soldiers to get home to their loved ones for Christmas. The right one is labeled mourning and shows a joyous scene of people gathered outside on Christmas morning. I just love Thomas Nast's attention to detail. But perhaps the most touching and moving print to come out of the Civil War era is this one for Christmas 1864, and it's entitled The Union Christmas. Printed on December 31st, 1864, the print shows President Lincoln standing at the door, inviting the Southern rebels to come in from the cold and snow and rejoin the Union. The picture shows a large banquet table with empty chairs, labeled Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and so forth, all the states of the Confederacy. The print has 4 inserts, with the lower left corner showing Lee surrendering to Grant. This illustration is a few months before that surrender actually took place. But by December of 1864, there was the full expectation that the surrender was going to happen. It was just a question of when. The lower right insert is captioned, "Lay down your arms and you will be welcome," which shows rebel soldiers being welcomed back into the Union. The upper right corner shows the rebels as the prodigal son returning home. The upper left corner shows a soldier bowing down to accept a pardon from Lady Liberty. Despite all the pain, loss, and suffering in the Civil War, in this print we see that by the end of 1864, there were signs of hope that the war was going to come to an end with a Union victory. Nast creates the image of hope by showing a country tired with war and willing to invite their former countrymen to once again sit at the table of fellowship and union. Now, this next image takes place a few months after the end of the Civil War. It's Christmas 1865. In this, you see the caption, "A Merry Christmas to All." It featured a portrait that we all today would recognize as Santa Claus. The image of Santa is surrounded by similar images showing the typical Christmas traditions of the 1860s. The long illustration at the bottom, however, shows the assassination of President Lincoln at Ford's Theater, an event that had tragically taken place in mid-April, just a few days after the actual end of the Civil War. Now, all kinds of people were affected by the Civil War, and even the great poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was certainly impacted. He experienced great sorrow personally during the war. His wife died in 1861. His eldest son was severely wounded in battle. In 1862, he wrote in his journal, "A Merry Christmas, say the children, but that is no more for me. On Christmas Day, 1864, he wrote a poem titled Christmas Bells, and you can clearly feel his sorrow when he says, "And in deep despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men." In another part of a poem, he expresses the horrors of the Civil War itself. "Then from each black, accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the South, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the headstones of a continent, and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men." The more positive parts of this poem were later set to music to become the song, the carol, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day." Now I want to turn to sharing with you some of the actual wording that various Civil War soldiers wrote about their Christmas experiences during the Civil War. This corporal on Christmas Day, 1862, notes the hardships of his camp experience and the realization that his loved ones back home are lonesome without him. He also expresses the widespread hope that the Civil War could soon be over, but it's going to take much longer to end the war. In our next one, captured soldiers on both sides were typically placed in some kind of a prison facility for at least some time before they were paroled or exchanged. The Libby prison in Richmond had a reputation of pretty bad conditions for Union prisoners in the early years of the Civil War. One Union president there was Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Cavada. He uses the common Christmas season happenings to contrast his prison realities with what should be true on Christmas Day in 1863. The north wind comes reeling in fitful gushes through the iron bars, and jingles a sleigh bell in the prisoner's ear, and puffs in his pale face with a breath suggestively odorous of eggnog. Christmas Day, a day which was made for smiles, not sighs, for laughter, not tears, for the hearth, not prison. Here we have a portion of the letter that Tally Simpson wrote to his sister. He sadly recalls how joyous his Christmas the year before was. He seriously questions, when will this war end? Soldiers on both sides suffered on Christmas Day. Here we have some of the writing of a Confederate General Gordon on Christmas Day, 1864. He describes how seriously weakened the South was by Christmas Day, 1864. Specifically, he wrote, "The one worn-out railroad running to the far South could not bring us half enough necessary supplies. And even if it could have transported Christmas boxes of good things, the people at home were too depleted to send them." Now I want to shift to giving you some information about my own great-grandfather, Sergeant John Ludebank Hoster of Connecticut. I hope it gives us some perspective as to how soldiers from the Finger Lakes actually experienced their various Christmas. Like many Civil War soldiers, Hoster kept a daily journal or diary for the whole time he served in the war. He started his military service in the summer of 1862 in the 148th New York Volunteers, who were stationed in the Norfolk, Virginia area, doing non-combat duty for the first year and a half of his military service. So, not surprisingly, on Christmas Day, he wrote in his journal of the splendid Christmas dinner he had that day. I'm going to come back and speak to that. His Christmas Day 1864 journal entry is in sharp contrast. In mid-June of 1864, he was captured along with 11 fellow soldiers in his company and imprisoned in the infamous Andersonville prison camp. On Christmas Day 1864, he is then a prisoner at a Confederate prison camp in Florence, South Carolina. This is what he wrote. Dull Christmas. 1 year ago today, I had the pleasure of sitting down to a fine roast goose with the necessary accompaniments to make it both agreeable to the eyes and palate. This was Corporal Spade's little house at Fort Norfolk, Virginia. After we had fully satisfied ourselves, Fred produced a box of cigars, and we enjoyed a pleasant smoke. How different my circumstances then and now. For dinner today, eaten at dark, sweet potato soup and meal dumplings, flavored with a small beef bone with a thimbleful of fat that William procured through the kindness of Frank Cook, a friend of his that works outside the camp. 3 years ago tonight, Miss Clark, Miss Spade, and myself spent the evening at John Spade Jr. at Canoga and had a pleasant time. Fortunately, my great-grandfather survived both Andersonville and the prison camp at Florence, but he clearly endured serious hardships. Now, it wasn't only the Southern soldiers that suffered greatly at Christmas time in the last part of the Civil War. Southern families had to endure a scarcity of goods as the Union blockade became so effective. One Southern mother explained to her children that even Santa Claus would not be able to run the formidable Union blockade, so there wouldn't be gifts from Santa that Christmas. Kevin Rawlings, in his book, tells of one Southern girl who plotted the course that Santa Claus would have to take to avoid the Union blockade if he were going to get his gifts through. I want to end this program on a more joyous note, so I share with you the true story of some Michigan soldiers serving in General Sherman's forces. Sherman's forces in their march to the sea had successfully cut a path of total destruction from Atlanta on their way to Savannah, Georgia. Just before Christmas Day, they had captured Savannah. On Christmas Day, 1864, this is, about 90 Michigan soldiers loaded several wagons full of food and other supplies and distributed the items about the households in the ravaged Georgia countryside. The soldiers had even decorated the mules that pulled the supply wagons with tree branches to make the mules look like reindeer. I hope the information I have shared with you has given you some insight into what Christmas was like during the Civil War for soldiers as well as their loved ones at home. I wish everyone happy holidays. May the holiday season bring joy to all and truly peace on earth.